There are some warnings you don't hear until it's too late. And then there are the ones whispered by strangers in hospital hallways. The kind that crack open everything you thought you knew about the person sleeping next to you. Narration begins. The hospital didn't smell like a hospital. That was the first thing she noticed as they walked through doors that opened without being touched, past a reception desk where a woman stood before they arrived. Already knowing their names, already smiling that careful, practiced smile that comes with greeting people who never wait in lines. There was no sharp bite of disinfectant cutting through the air. No chaos echoing off linoleum floors. No sense of urgency bleeding through the walls like you'd expect from a place where bodies break and sometimes don't heal. Instead, it smelled faintly of polished wood and something floral, restrained, expensive, as if even illness had been asked to behave itself here. This was where money came when it got hurt. The husband walked slightly ahead despite the sling cradling his left arm, his posture unchanged, his presence pulling the air forward in the way gravity pulls water downhill. Wealth has a way of arriving before the person does. It softens voices around it. It straightens spines. It makes doors close quietly instead of slam. She, his wife, followed half a step behind, matching his pace out of habit rather than need. A rhythm they'd fallen into years ago. So natural now she didn't question it. She noticed things when she walked. Always had. The way the floor absorbed sound instead of reflecting it. The way the lighting avoided shadows entirely, as if darkness itself had been designed out of the space. The way other patients in the hallway glanced at them, then looked away quickly, as though there were rules they understood without being told. A broken bone. That's all this was supposed to be. An accident at one of his properties. A misjudged step on scaffolding that hadn't been properly secured. A fall that would be explained later in a lighter tone. Over dinner with people who mattered, with the assurance that everything was under control. The kind of story that ended cleanly. The kind that never lingered in the mind afterward. They reached the orthopedic wing where glass walls looked out onto a city softened by height and distance. Somewhere beyond that view, traffic moved in angry bursts. People hurried with coffee going cold in their hands. Lives continued in their loud, ordinary, beautifully chaotic way. But in here, time felt folded inward, slowed down and padded with money until even seconds felt expensive. A nurse met them at the threshold of the examination room. She was unremarkable in the way people often are when they've learned how not to be seen. Middle-aged, with calm eyes and hair pulled back with care rather than haste. Her badge was clipped neatly to her scrubs, turned just enough to catch the light when she moved. She smiled, but it was a professional smile, measured, practiced, gone as soon as it had served its purpose. She greeted the husband first. Her tone shifted almost imperceptibly when she said his name. Not warmth exactly, not fear either. Something closer to acknowledgement, the way you might acknowledge an expensive vase while moving around it. Something important, something handled often, something that came with instructions. She asked how he was feeling, explained the next steps in that smooth, rehearsed way medical professionals have when they've said the same words 1,000 times. She gestured toward the bed with its crisp white sheets that had probably never been slept in by anyone who couldn't afford to be there. The wife stood near the door, hands folded loosely in front of her, watching the exchange with a quiet attention that had become second nature over the years. She knew the rhythms of rooms like this, the way people spoke around her husband, voices calibrated differently, explanations shortened, consent assumed rather than asked for. She'd learned to read these interactions the way sailors read weather. The nurse turned then, her attention finally settling on the wife. And for a moment, just a moment, nothing happened. Just a low hum of air conditioning. The faint, steady pulse of monitors somewhere down the hall. Footsteps passing in the corridor beyond, then fading into expensive silence. But the nurse held her gaze. It wasn't a long look. It didn't linger in any obvious way. But there was weight in it, a pause that felt intentional, like a held breath before a confession. "I'll be right back," the nurse said, her voice neutral again, professional. "Just need to grab a form from the station." She stepped out of the room, leaving the door open behind her. The husband was already distracted, phone in his good hand, scrolling with the ease of someone who'd never been told to wait for anything. The wife watched him for a moment, the way his thumb moved across the screen, the slight furrow between his eyebrows that meant he was reading something that annoyed him. And then, without quite deciding to do so, she followed the nurse into the hallway. The corridor was empty. The lighting here was softer, more forgiving than the examination room. The walls absorbed sound the way deep water absorbs stones, completely, without echo. The nurse had stopped just a few steps away. Her back turned as though she were reading something on a clipboard. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Please don't be alarmed." The words landed strangely, not because of their content, but because of their placement. People didn't usually say things like that to her. Not here. Not in her life. Alarm was for other people. People who didn't have the buffer of wealth between themselves and the world's sharp edges. "I know this is none of my business," the nurse continued, still not facing her, "and I won't say anything more than this." She turned then. Up close, her eyes were steady. Tired. Perhaps the kind of tired that comes from years rather than hours. But clear. There was no panic in them. No drama. Just something resolved. A decision already made, and now being acted upon despite the cost. "Be careful," the nurse said quietly, with him. The wife felt the sentence move through her slowly, as though it were passing through something thick, honey or amber, or the space between sleeping and waking. "I'm sorry?" she asked, instinctively polite even in confusion. The nurse shook her head once, very slightly. "That's all I can say," she replied. "I shouldn't even have said that." A silence settled between them. Not awkward, not rushed. A silence that felt deliberate, as though it were meant to hold what had just been given, for words that shouldn't have been spoken but were anyway. "Is there something wrong?" the wife asked. "With the procedure? With—" The nurse's mouth tightened, just enough to suggest restraint. "He's being well taken care of," she said carefully. "Physically." Another pause, heavy with implication. "And so should you be." Footsteps echoed faintly at the far end of the corridor. The sound of someone approaching, distant but inevitable, the way consequences approach. The nurse stepped back immediately, already retreating into her professional role, like a turtle pulling into its shell, her shoulders squared, her expression smoothed into that practiced neutrality. "I'll get that form," she said, louder now, safer. "We'll start imaging shortly." And then she was gone, her shoes making no sound at all as she disappeared around the corner, leaving the wife standing alone in a hallway that suddenly felt colder despite the expensive climate control. Nothing about the exchange had been dramatic. There had been no raised voices, no accusations, no specific warning to dissect or dismiss. Just a sentence. 4 words, spoken calmly, without urgency. "Be careful with him." The wife stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the phrase turning slowly in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water, examined from different angles, catching different light depending on how you held it. She returned to the examination room with the words still suspended in her thoughts. Her husband looked up his phone and smiled when he noticed her, the smile he gave investors, clients, people he needed something from but didn't particularly care about. She'd learned to distinguish his smiles years ago. This one didn't reach his eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, because that was the answer she'd learned to give. The answer that smoothed things over. The answer that kept the machinery running. She took her seat beside the bed, her hands resting in her lap. She listened to the soft beeping of a monitor. She felt the controlled stillness of the room settle again like dust after a disturbance. But something had shifted. The warning didn't arrive like fear, sudden and sharp. It arrived like memory, like recognition, as though something she had known once, long ago, had been named aloud by a stranger and handed back to her gently, carefully, the way you'd return something precious that had been lost. When the nurse returned, a different expression now, all business and efficiency. The examination began. X-rays were ordered. Forms were signed. Medical language was spoken in that particular dialect, designed to sound reassuring while revealing almost nothing. And the wife found herself watching more closely than before, listening not just to words, but to what moved beneath them like currents under ice. The way the nurse avoided lingering in the room longer than necessary. The way she never turned her back fully to the husband. The way she spoke to him with precision and distance, the careful language of someone handling something dangerous. Nothing happened, nothing dramatic, nothing she could point to and say, "There, that's wrong." And yet, the hallway felt closer now, the silence heavier, the expensive lighting somehow less forgiving. That evening, back in a recovery suite that overlooked the city from a height that made everything below appear arranged rather than lived in, she watched her husband sleep, watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, watched the way his face relaxed into something almost peaceful when he wasn't performing consciousness. She thought about the locked room in their house that required a code instead of a key. Security, he'd called it. Protection. The kind that came with success. She thought about the documents she'd signed without reading because his lawyer had assured her it was standard. The credit cards in her name that somehow had limits she hadn't set. The friends who'd stopped calling after he'd mentioned, so casually, that they seemed like a bad influence. Small things. Tiny things. Things too small to name at the time. But together, in this new light cast by 4 words from a stranger, they began to form a shape. The city breathed beyond the glass. Lights bleeding into each other. Traffic flowing in patterns that looked random but weren't. Thousands of lives intersected without ever touching. She pressed her hand against the window and felt how cold it was despite the warmth of the room. Somewhere in this building, that nurse was finishing her shift, going home to a life the wife would never know, carrying the weight of what she'd risked by speaking. A risk the wife was only beginning to understand, because in places like this, where money moved like weather and shaped everything it touched, silence wasn't just golden, it was enforced, and the woman who'd broken it, who'd whispered a warning in a hallway designed for discretion, had done something either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. The wife suspected it was both. So here's what I need you to ask yourself. When someone who has nothing to gain and everything to lose reaches across the divide of professional silence to warn you, do you listen? Or do you go back to sleep in a room with expensive sheets and tell yourself that comfort is the same thing as safety? The next morning, she did something she'd never done before. She lied. Not a big lie. Not the kind that changes everything in a single moment. Just a small one. The kind that opens a door you didn't know was there. When her husband asked where she was going, she smiled and said she needed air. A walk. Maybe the hospital cafe. He nodded without looking up from his tablet, already back in a world that mattered to him. Conference calls and quarterly projections and decisions made in rooms she was never invited into. But she didn't go to the cafe. She went back to that hallway, the one where a stranger had cracked open her carefully constructed life with 4 words and then disappeared like smoke. The lighting was the same, soft, expensive, designed to make you forget you were in a place where people came to heal from things that broke them. Her footsteps made no sound on floors that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. She was looking for the nurse. Or maybe she was looking for proof that the conversation had even happened, that she hadn't imagined the weight in those tired eyes, the deliberate pause before speaking, the risk taken for a woman she didn't know. But the nurses at the station were different, younger. They smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes when she asked, so casually, so carefully, about the woman who'd been assigned to her husband's case the day before. "Oh," one of them said, glancing at her colleague with a look that lasted half a second too long. "She's been reassigned." The answer came too quickly, too smoothly, like it had been prepared. "Reassigned where?" the wife asked. The nurse's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. A door closing, a light switching off. "I'm not sure. Different department. You know how it is, staffing needs change." Except she didn't know how it was. Because in her world, things didn't just change. They were changed by people with the power to rearrange reality until it looked the way they needed it to look. The wife thanked them and walked away, her pulse doing something strange in her throat. Reassigned. The word followed her down the corridor like a shadow. Not fired. Not transferred. Reassigned. Passive voice, no actor, no agency. As if the nurse had simply been moved by forces beyond anyone's control, like furniture in a room being redecorated. She found herself at the end of a corridor she didn't remember walking down. There was a door here unmarked. The kind of door you pass without noticing because nothing about it invites attention. But something made her stop. Maybe instinct. Maybe the way the silence felt thicker here, like the air itself was holding its breath. The handle turned easily. Inside, the room was smaller than she expected. No windows, no view, just a desk and a filing cabinet pushed against the wall. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, a sound she felt in her teeth. On the desk, folders, stacked neatly, labels facing up. Her husband's name was on the top one. Her hand moved before her mind caught up, reaching, touching, opening. The folder contained medical reports, imaging results, doctor's notes written in that cramped handwriting that made everything look urgent and illegible at the same time. But she could read the dates. 3 months ago, 7 months before that, a year and a half earlier. Visits she didn't know about, injuries she'd never been told of, x-rays of bones that had been broken and healed and broken again, fractures that the reports described with clinical precision, compression consistent with applied force, stress patterns indicative of repeated trauma. Healing evidence suggests multiple incidents. Her breath caught, because the story she'd been told, the story of a single accident, a misjudged step, scaffolding that gave way, didn't match what she was reading. This wasn't a fall. Or, if it was, it wasn't the first one, or the second, or the third. How many times can someone accidentally break the same bones before it stops being an accident? She flipped through pages, her hand steady even as something cold spread through her chest. There were notes in the margins, some circled, some underlined. Medical terminology she didn't fully understand but could guess at. Defensive positioning, impact inconsistent with reported mechanism, patient narrative unreliable. And then, on a page near the back, a different kind of note, handwritten, not by a doctor. Patient exhibits controlling behavior toward spouse. Recommend social work consult. Declined by patient. The room felt smaller suddenly, the buzzing light louder. She closed the folder carefully, exactly as she'd found it, and backed out of the room. The hallway was still empty, but it felt different now. Like the walls were watching, like the cameras in the corners had recorded everything, and somewhere, someone was already deciding what to do about it. When she returned to the recovery suite, her husband was awake. He looked up from his phone with that smile, the one that had charmed investors out of millions, that had convinced her, years ago, that she'd found someone who saw her as an equal rather than an acquisition. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to wonder." She set her bag down slowly, buy herself seconds to arrange her face into something normal. "Just wandering," she said. "This place is a maze," he agreed, his attention already drifting back to the screen. Easy to get lost. But she heard something underneath the words. Or maybe she was just listening differently now, paying attention to the spaces between what was said and what was meant. Easy to get lost. Was that a statement or a warning? The days that followed had a strange quality to them, like living inside a photograph that's slowly developing, details emerging from blankness into clarity. She began to notice things she'd trained herself not to see. The way he insisted on knowing who entered the room before they crossed the threshold. The way his phone never left his hand. Even while he slept, screen always face down as though hiding something from the air itself. The way conversation stopped when she walked in, not abruptly, but smoothly, like a practiced motion, like dancers who rehearsed the choreography. None of this was new. That's what unsettled her most. She'd accepted these details before as the texture of his life. The cost of proximity to power, the necessary distance between what was shared and what was managed. She'd told herself that discretion wasn't secrecy, that privacy wasn't control. But now the nurse's voice hovered at the edge of every memory, quiet but persistent. Be careful with him. She started paying attention to things she'd been taught not to question, like the first time she'd been asked not to accompany him into a meeting that took place in their own home. The explanation had been gentle, almost apologetic, sensitive discussions, time-sensitive matters. It would be boring for her anyway. She'd smiled and agreed because that's what you did when someone you loved asked for space. Or the first room in the house that required a code instead of a key. Security, he'd explained. Protection. The kind that came with success. She'd never asked what was kept inside because asking felt like not trusting, and not trusting felt like failing at being the kind of partner he needed. Or the first time she'd noticed her name missing from a document that affected them both. A clerical oversight, he'd assured her, corrected later, though she never saw the final version because there were always more important things to focus on, weren't there? At the time, each moment had felt too small to name, too insignificant to deserve attention. But together, they began to form a pattern, like stars that look random until someone shows you the constellation. One afternoon, while he slept, she returned to that corridor. The door to the unmarked room was still unlocked, as if whoever used it had such confidence in the building's security, in the understanding that certain people didn't go where they weren't supposed to. That lock seemed unnecessary. This time, she went further inside. The filing cabinet wasn't locked either. 3 drawers, each one filled with folders organized with obsessive precision. She found his name again, but this time there were more files. Earlier dates, different hospitals, a trail of documented injuries stretching back years, back before they were married, back to when she thought she was the luckiest woman alive to have caught his attention. Radius fracture, left arm. Patient reports fall during recreational activity. Rib contusion. Patient reports accident while moving furniture. Metacarpal fracture, right hand. Patient reports impact with hard surface. Details unclear. The language was careful, clinical, but underneath the professional distance, she could read the doubt, the quiet, documented skepticism of medical professionals who'd seen these patterns before and knew what they meant. And then she found something else. A folder with a different name. A woman's name she didn't recognize. Inside, similar reports, similar injuries, similar dates, years ago, overlapping with the time before he'd met her. Photographs of bruises documented with clinical precision. A restraining order that had apparently been filed and then withdrawn. A settlement agreement with an NDA attached. Her hands went numb, because suddenly the nurse's warning wasn't about what might happen. It was about what had already happened to someone else, to someone who'd been where she was standing now, figuratively speaking, and had tried to leave and been, what? Paid off? Threatened? Erased from his history, so completely that even the woman he'd married next had never known she existed? How do you disappear a whole person from someone's past? The answer was in her hands. Money, lawyers, institutions that valued discretion over truth, and people who understood that silence could be purchased if the price was right. She returned the folder exactly as she'd found it. When she got back to the suite, he was awake, standing at the window with his phone pressed to his ear. The glass door to the balcony was closed, but she could see his lips moving, his free hand gesturing with controlled precision he used when he was managing something, a situation, a person, a problem that needed to be solved. He didn't notice her enter. She watched his reflection in the glass. The way his face remained calm, even as his voice, muffled but audible through the door, took on that particular tone he used when he was giving instructions that weren't really suggestions. She couldn't make out words, just a cadence of command. When the call ended, he stayed outside longer than necessary, looking down at the city as if confirming something about the world below, how small it was, how manageable, how easily controlled from this height. The rain started that evening, not suddenly, not with drama, just a soft, persistent tapping against the glass, as if the city itself were trying to be let in. The lights below blurred, each reflection stretching and dissolving in water's slow movement. The wife sat in the dimness of the suite, the room reduced to quiet shapes and muted tones. Her husband slept soundly, his breathing even in practice, the sound of someone accustomed to rest without fear, without the weight of conscience, without wondering if the person next to you knows what you've done. She couldn't sleep. Some nights do that to you, open instead of closing. Give you hours to think about things you've been avoiding. Force you to look directly at what you've been seeing peripherally for years. She rose and moved toward the window, her reflection appearing in the glass like a ghost, translucent, barely there, overlaid on the city lights below. The paper she'd taken from the file room was in her bag. She'd told herself she wouldn't look at it again, that reading it once was enough. But her hands moved anyway, unfolding it carefully in the low light. Compression marks inconsistent with impact. Stress fractures not explained by a single event. Language consistent with repeated trauma. Repeated. The word sat heavy in her mind. Not once. Not an accident. Not a mistake or a misjudgment or bad luck. repeated, which meant choice. Pattern, intention, which meant the man sleeping peacefully 10 feet away had done this before. To himself? To someone else? The reports weren't clear, or maybe they were clear in the way that medical professionals learn to be clear when they suspect something but can't prove it. Documentation that says everything and nothing, evidence preserved for a future that might never come. A sound behind her made her turn. He stood in the doorway, half lit by the ambient glow from the city, his figure solid and present in the way that people with power are present, taking up more space than their bodies require. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. "So are you," she replied. His eyes moved to the paper in her hand. Not immediately, not with alarm, just a slow shift of attention, the way a predator might notice movement in its peripheral vision. "What's that?" he asked, his voice still soft, still controlled. And in that moment, with the rain pressing against the glass and the city breathing below and the truth finally, undeniably present in the room between them, she had to decide. Because here's the question that changes everything. When you finally see clearly what you've been trained not to notice, when the evidence is literally in your hands and the person who's been shaping your reality is standing right in front of you asking what you know, do you show your cards? Or do you fold them carefully and wait for a better hand? What would you do if you realized the person you love most had been erasing people, maybe even versions of yourself, all along? She looked at the paper in her hand, then back at him, and something inside her made a choice before her conscious mind could catch up. "I went for a walk today," she said instead of answering his question directly. He watched her carefully now, his body language unchanged, but his attention sharpening in that way she'd learned to recognize, the way a lens focuses, bringing something blurry into sudden, dangerous clarity. "You do that a lot lately," he replied. There was no accusation in his voice, just observation. But observation from him had always carried weight, like he was cataloging information, filing it away for future use. "I found a room," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt, "with files." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, packed tight with all the things he was deciding not to say, all the calculations happening behind eyes that had convinced boardrooms and city councils and her, once upon a time, that he was someone who could be trusted. "You shouldn't wander into restricted areas," he said finally, his tone still mild, reasonable. "This hospital values privacy." "So do you," she said. The words landed between them, neither accusation nor defense, just fact. He took a step closer, and she noticed for the first time how he moved in spaces, not aggressive, not threatening, but with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been told no in a way that stuck. "You're tired," he said, and his voice had shifted into that particular register he used when he was managing her. "This week has been stressful for both of us." But she'd heard him use that same tone on conference calls when someone questioned his decisions. Soothing, dismissive, a verbal pat on the head that made you doubt what you'd seen with your own eyes. She unfolded the paper completely and placed it on the desk between them. "This was dated before the accident," she said. "Before the fall you told me about. And it wasn't the first one." He looked at it then, really looked, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw the calculation surface openly. Not anger, not panic, just cold, careful assessment, like he was looking at a problem that had unexpectedly become more complicated and required recalculation. "That nurse," he said slowly, each word chosen with precision. "Did she speak to you?" The question itself was an answer, because he didn't ask what nurse or which nurse. He knew exactly who she meant, which meant he'd already been thinking about it, already been managing it. "Yes," she said. The rain pressed harder against the glass, filling the silence between them. "She shouldn't have," he said, and there was something in his voice now. Not threat exactly, but certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from having made things happen before, from knowing that the world bends when you apply the right pressure in the right places. "She tried to help me," the wife said. He exhaled softly, a sound that might have been disappointment or might have been something colder. "She put herself at risk," he replied. "People forget what institutions protect, what they're designed to protect." And there it was, the truth underneath the truth. Institutions didn't protect patients or nurses or wives. They protected power. They protected people who could afford lawyers and make donations, and ensure that certain stories never got told in ways that mattered. That's what she was trying to save me from, the wife said quietly. From disappearing into something managed, from becoming another file in a locked room. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You don't need to do this," he said, and now there was something almost pleading in his voice, though the words themselves were framed as reassurance. "You're safe here. With me. You've always been safe." The words settled between them like sediment in water. Safe. Safe meant controlled. Safe meant quiet. Safe meant never asking the wrong question again, never wandering into rooms she wasn't supposed to enter, never talking to nurses who saw too much and cared too dangerously. She thought about the other woman whose name was in that file, the one who'd come before her, the one who'd been erased so completely that even Google searches turned up nothing, just gaps where a person used to be, filled in with money and legal documents and agreements that turned voices into silence. What happened to her? She wondered. And how long before I become the same kind of absence? "I know," she said finally, and she watched relief flicker across his face. Brief but genuine. "Good," he said. "I'll take care of it." The nurse. The file. The misunderstanding. The nurse. He said it so casually, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person who'd risked something real to whisper a warning to a stranger. "I need air," the wife said. She stepped onto the balcony before he could respond, before he could manage her feelings or explain them away or convince her that what she'd seen wasn't what she thought it was. The rain cooled her skin instantly, running down her face like tears she hadn't cried yet. The city breathed below, oblivious, ongoing, thousands of lives intersecting without ever touching, people making choices in kitchens and cars and corners that would change everything or nothing at all. She stayed there until the storm softened, until the rain exhausted itself, until her clothes were soaked and her hands were numb, and a decision had solidified inside her into something she couldn't unmake. When she came back inside, the room felt different, not because anything had changed in the physical space, but because she had changed inside it, the way a snake changes when it sheds its skin. The same creature, but no longer contained by what used to hold it. He'd gone back to bed, or was pretending to sleep. She couldn't tell which, and realized it didn't matter anymore. She picked up her phone with hands that had stopped shaking. First, she photographed every page of the medical report. Then she forwarded the images to an email address she'd memorized but never thought she'd use, a lawyer whose card she'd been handed at a charity event 2 years ago by a woman who'd looked at her with knowing eyes and said, "Just in case you ever need someone who can't be bought." She kept the card in her wallet, buried behind receipts and coffee shop loyalty stamps, and told herself she'd never need it. But some part of her, the part that noticed things, that cataloged small violations and locked doors and missing names, had known better. The message she typed was simple. "I need help. I have evidence." He can't know. She powered down the phone before she could second-guess herself. Then she wrote a note. Not long, not dramatic, just clear. "I'm leaving. Don't look for me." The copies have already been sent. She placed it on the desk where he'd see it first thing in the morning, weighted down with the hospital-issued water glass that cost more than some people's monthly rent. And then, in the pre-dawn darkness while the city was still sleeping and the hospital hallways were quiet, except for the soft beeping of machines keeping people alive, she walked out. No scenes, no confrontations, no desperate explanation or final argument. Just one foot in front of the other, carrying only her bag and the evidence and the knowledge that the life she was walking away from had been built on foundations that were never solid to begin with. The automatic doors opened for her the same way they'd opened when she arrived, smoothly, quietly, as if exits were just as important as entrances in places where money controlled everything, including who got to leave. Outside, the air smelled like rain and exhaust and possibility. She didn't look back. Because here's what she'd learned in that hospital. Some prisons have beautiful views and expensive sheets and people who smile while they lock the doors. And the only way out is to walk through them before someone convinces you they were never locked at all. 6 months later, she sat in an apartment that would have fit inside her old closet. The furniture was secondhand. The view looked onto a brick wall and a fire escape where pigeons roost and complain about the weather. The coffee maker was temperamental, and the shower pressure was terrible, and she'd never been happier in her life. She worked now. Actually worked, not the decorative philanthropy she'd done before. A non-profit that helped women navigate the legal system when leaving dangerous situations. The pay was a fraction of what she'd once spent on shoes without thinking about it. She loved every minute. Her phone rang. The new one, with the new number that only a handful of people had. She didn't recognize the caller ID, but something made her answer anyway. "Hello, is this Sarah?" The voice was familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Calm, tired, careful. "This is the nurse," the woman continued, "from the hospital. I wasn't sure if you'd remember." "I remember," Sarah said, and her voice came out rough with emotion she hadn't expected. "Are you okay?" He said he'd. I was worried he'd. "I'm fine," the nurse said. "I left that hospital the day after we spoke. I should have left years ago, but—" She paused. "Your husband wasn't the first patient I'd seen like that, but you were the first wife who seemed like she might actually listen." Sarah's hand gripped the phone tighter. "There are others?" she asked. "There have always been others," the nurse replied. "Women in hospital rooms with men who hurt them, and institutions that protect the wrong people. I've been documenting cases for years. Quietly, carefully, building evidence for something I wasn't sure would ever happen." "What changed?" "You did," the nurse said simply. "You left with the evidence. You filed a complaint. You gave other women permission to come forward." Sarah's laptop sat open on her kitchen table, the screen showing a news article she'd been afraid to read until now. The headline: "Major hospital system under investigation following abuse allegations. Your lawyer contacted me," the nurse continued, "said there might be a case. Not just against your ex-husband, but against the hospital, the system that enabled it, the culture that protected abusers as long as they had the right insurance and the right last name." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but opening, like a seed splitting to let something grow. "There are 3 other women," the nurse said. 3 that I know of, maybe more. Women who signed NDAs and disappeared into settlements that bought their silence. But you didn't sign. You didn't stay quiet. And now they're reconsidering their options. The rain had started again outside Sarah's window. Different city, different life, different rain. But somehow the same. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "I need you to do what you've already been doing," the nurse replied. "Keep talking. Keep existing. Keep being proof that leaving is possible." They talked for another hour about legal strategies and support networks and the underground railroad of medical professionals who documented abuse and helped women escape when the institutions they work for wouldn't. When the call ended, Sarah sat in her small apartment with its terrible shower pressure and its view of a brick wall and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free. Not safe. Freedom and safety aren't the same thing. But free to make her own choices. Free to answer her own questions. Free to walk through unlocked doors and know that she could walk back out again. 2 months after that, she stood in a different hospital hallway. This one smelled like disinfectant and echoed with the normal chaos of a public hospital where people waited in lines and insurance mattered but didn't buy you silence. She was there as an advocate now, part of the nonprofit's hospital liaison program. Her job was to notice things, to pay attention to the details that others missed, to ask the questions that made people uncomfortable. She saw her halfway down the corridor, a woman sitting beside a man who had his arm in a cast, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes carefully neutral in a way that Sarah recognized like looking in a mirror. The man was on his phone, distracted. The woman was watching everything and nothing, the way you do when you've learned that paying too much attention gets you in trouble, but not paying enough is dangerous. Sarah knew that look, had worn it herself for years. She approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Excuse me," she said gently. The woman looked up, and for just a moment, their eyes met. In that moment, Sarah saw everything. The careful control, the practiced smile, the fear underneath the polish, the recognition that something was wrong, but not the words to name it yet. I'm sorry to bother you, Sarah continued. I'm with Patient Advocacy Services. I just wanted to make sure you knew about our resources. If you ever need someone to talk to or help navigate anything, no judgment, no questions you don't want to answer. She held out a card, simple, professional, with a phone number that was answered 24 hours a day by people who understood that leaving wasn't a moment. It was a process. The woman took it carefully, her fingers brushing Sarah's for just a second. Thank you, she said quietly. The man looked up from his phone, then his attention sharpening. What's this about? He asked, his voice pleasant but with an edge underneath. Sarah smiled her most professional smile, the one she'd learned from watching powerful people, but repurposed for something better. Just information about our services, she said. We provide it to all patients and their families. He nodded, already dismissing her, already looking back at his screen. But the woman's fingers had tightened on the card. Sarah walked away, her heart beating hard, knowing she'd just done what that nurse had done for her. Taken a risk, broken a silence, handed someone the beginning of a possibility. She didn't know if the woman would call. Didn't know if the card would end up in a trash can or buried in a wallet or thrown away by the man who didn't want his wife talking to advocates. But she planted a seed. And sometimes that's all you can do. So here's my question for you. How many women are sitting in hospital rooms right now, in expensive suites with beautiful views, being told they're safe by the very people they need protection from? And what would change if just one person, maybe you, learned to recognize the signs, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to hand someone a card with a number they might need someday? Because warnings aren't just about words. They're about choices. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is whisper for words to a stranger. Be careful with him. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the silences in your own life or the people around you who might need someone to notice, share it. Talk about it. Because every conversation about coercive control, about institutional complicity, about the courage it takes to leave, every single one makes it a little bit easier for the next woman who needs to walk through those doors. And if you're that woman right now, the one sitting in the expensive room wondering if what you're experiencing is real, it is. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. And there are people waiting to help you the moment you're ready. The warning has been given. What you do with it is up to you.